Hey there, everybody. My name is Kat Bowser. I'm your resident fantasy therapist, and welcome back to my channel. Those of you here for the first time, welcome. My name is Kat Bowser. I'm a licensed therapist. I'm also a writer working on my first novel. And on my channel, I'd like to talk about what I consider to be the heart of all writing, and that's in the characters, and the heart of the characters is in their psychology. So that is the angle I like to take with pretty much everything I talk about on my channel. So today we are continuing my trope diagnosis series. This is my last one for March. And for the month of March, I've been talking about tropes that I do not necessarily agree with or like, but that doesn't mean that they are necessarily quote unquote wrong. This one for today, it's one I do consider to be a dangerous trope to promote. So I have actually been seeing less of it, which is great. But I do think it's an interesting phenomenon as to why we even have this trope in the first place. So today we are talking about the trope of quote unquote real men don't cry. Like I said, this month has been tropes I don't like. I really, really do not like this one. Speaking from a psychological point of view, I think this trope is not a healthy one to promote. But like I said, I think the reason we even have it as a trope is an interesting phenomenon. So I kind of wanted to talk about that. So basically, the root of this trope is that you have characters who are considered to be strong, aggressive, what we would call manly men, because they don't show emotion, they don't cry. They are seen as this very almost stoic kind of figure who is supposed to be this representation of strength. Not true. Let's talk about emotion here for a second. So basically, when we are young, up until about the age of 12, boys and girls cry about the same amount. After that point, girls tend to cry 3 to 4 times more than boys do. And this is heavily implied to be a product of socialization. So, kind of this idea that when you're young, it's okay to cry because you're a child. You are still learning, you're still expected to be protected, that kind of thing. But once you hit 12, which is usually about the point where puberty kind of starts to kick in, then you have different societal roles placed on you. And boys in particular are expected to be the provider, the strong one, and not the emotional one. That is usually a trait associated with females. So why is this a problem? Because men have the same psychological needs as women. They have pains and fears and all those kinds of things that women have. And the problem is that they're essentially being told that it's not okay for them to express sadness or fear or things like that. That doesn't mean they don't feel it. And what we have found is that when you repress emotion, several things happen. First and foremost, it comes out somewhere. If you're repressing emotion, then it's still going to manifest in another form. So let's say that you are under, let's use stress as an example, because I think that's one that everybody can relate to pretty well. So if you're under an unusual amount of stress for whatever reason, job, family, whatever, pick a reason, and you don't engage in a way to alleviate that stress, it's going to start showing up in physical manifestations: headaches, backaches, neck aches, stomach pains, things like that. People that are under a lot of stress essentially have their adrenaline pumping, and when there is no alleviation to this adrenaline, it does start to damage the body. And that's essentially what happens with any kind of emotion that is not allowed expression: sadness, anger, fear, all that stuff. If it's not allowed expression, then essentially what is happening is your body is kicking adrenaline in to keep it repressed. And so the constant adrenaline is damaging the body. And that can lead to both mental health issues and physical health issues. Because as I've said on my channel before, physical and mental health are not separate entities, they are intertwined. So your mental health affects your physical health and vice versa. So the other thing that tends to happen, and what we are starting to see, we're starting to explore this a little bit, and that is this idea that essentially when an emotion is triggered, there is essentially what we call an activating event. Something happens and it triggers an emotional response in the body, and then you have a behavior. You will sometimes see this referred to as ABC. And what we're finding is that if C doesn't happen, which is essentially the natural response to a behavior, then the body almost feels incomplete. It senses that this cycle has not been completed. And that leads to emotional distress. It can lead to confusion in the body so that emotions are harder to recognize. And that becomes a problem if you're trying to socialize. Being able to understand and read others' emotions as well as read and understand your own is something that we use on a daily basis. And what we have found is that people that frequently repress their emotions, after a certain amount of time, it becomes difficult for them to even recognize them because they're so used to keeping them pushed down and trying to essentially not pay attention to them. And then that becomes a problem if they actually come into therapy and they're trying to fix this. One of the things that actually takes the longest is getting them to understand what emotion is what, which is something that we usually learn when we're very young children. But like I said, if you repress it long enough, the body forgets. And then that's a problem. The other thing is, naturally, like I've said before, this is primarily based on essentially the social roles that we place on different genders. And I think the big problem with it is that we've assigned different acceptable emotions to different genders. For example, women, as a general rule, it's okay for us to get emotional and sad and upset because that is something that is associated with our role. And so if you start to cry and be upset or hurt, it's expected, and society doesn't frown on it as a general rule. It's kind of like, okay, that's quote unquote what women do. Men, anger is the acceptable emotion. It's okay, quote unquote, for men to get aggressive and yell and scream. And that's not healthy either. But let me make something very, very clear. There's nothing wrong with anger. So being angry, there's nothing wrong with that emotion. It becomes a problem when it becomes a fuel for aggressive behavior. So if I get angry and I storm off to like my own personal space and I scream and yell there, that's fine. That's actually considered a healthy way to handle it. But if I get angry and I punch the guy that made me angry, that's a problem, because that's going to lead to a lot of relationship problems, problems with the law, lots of different problems. So, what is the other thing I want to bring up with this? One thing that we have noticed is with people that cry more readily is their self-esteem is much, much higher because they are allowed to be truthful with themselves. And I think that's really what this repression of crying does to people. Is it's essentially telling them how you feel is wrong, how you feel is not acceptable, and you shouldn't be acting this way. And that creates a sense of guilt and shame. And guilt and shame tears down your self esteem like almost nothing else will. And another little nitpick of information that I think people will find interesting, we actually have three different types of tears. We have what are called reflex tears, which are basically tears that occur when you get something in your eye, when there's a bright flash, things like that. And they're essentially created to moisturize your eyes and keep them safe. Then you have what we refer to as, I think they refer to them as basal tears. I think that's the term we use now. This is essentially a reaction to pain. So if you get physically hurt, this is something that occurs. And as to why it occurs, we think it started as kind of a cultural communication. So if you were physically hurt, you would cry to show people that you were in need of assistance. That's the theory, anyway. The third one is the one I'm going to talk about, and these are called emotional tears. These are tears that are shed in response to emotion, anger, sadness, fear, all that stuff. And what we have found is if you look at these tears under a microscope, they are all different. They are all cellularly different. And emotion tears are chock full of stress hormones because the body is trying to get rid of this stress that it is feeling, this extra adrenaline. So that phrase, have a good cry, is actually correct because when you cry from an emotional response, you actually are getting rid of all this excess adrenaline, stress hormones, and so you literally feel better after you cry because you've gotten rid of some of these chemicals. So that is something to bear in mind. And I just think really what it boils down to is we have become unbalanced in representation of emotion, in that it's okay for this group, but it's not okay for that group. When in fact, given all this research, it should be okay for everybody. And that really starts with teaching young kids, like I said, especially around the age of puberty, that it is okay for them to cry and be upset and be afraid. Because if you don't have an outlet, you find one. And a lot of times these are negative outlets. I cannot tell you how many teenagers I have worked with that have had depression, anger problems, social problems, impulse control issues, things like that. Or they cut, they use drugs, they drink, that kind of thing. And I would say 9 out of 10 of them have the same reasoning, in that they can't show their emotion for whatever reason. And so they find another way to try and let these emotions out. One of the things I hear the most from people who self-harm is they either do it to feel anything because they have grown numb, or they do it to give their emotional pain a physical outlet. And that is something that crying was essentially designed to do. It was designed to give us a physical outlet for emotional pain. So I'm really passionate on this one because I think the more that we tell people that they should repress certain emotions, the worse off they are. And I'll give you guys an example. I've been working with several clients for several years, and I believe on average it takes about 2 to 3 years for me to get someone who has been trained to repress their emotion to really start to let it out. And when they first start to, there is so much guilt and shame that you have to work through and get them to essentially reprogram that thought process. No, this is okay. This is okay. I'm not going to get in trouble. This doesn't mean I'm less of a person. It doesn't mean that I'm not strong or any of that stuff. It's okay. Because those messages are so thoroughly ingrained in your head. So if we can start getting rid of this trope, and showing that this kind of emotional expression is not only okay but should be encouraged and is healthy, then we are much, much better off. So that's why I wanted to kind of touch on this one a little bit, because it's a little close to home for me. So thank you guys for chiming in to hear my little soapbox, I guess you could say. As always, if you guys like this content, make sure to comment below or send me messages on any of my social media listed below. I love responding to them. If you guys want to make sure you don't miss whenever I upload, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell, and you'll know whenever a new video goes up. I try to upload every Friday, every Sunday. And as always, if you guys have any requests, feel free to send them my way. I will get to them as soon as I can. And until next time, I hope you guys have a good one.